Welcome back. And now we'll hear from Dr. Dennis Ojima on the role of partnerships for climate protection. Dr. Ojima is currently serving as the president of the Ecological Society of America. He is an emeritus professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability and a senior research science at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at CSU. He has received recognition for his contributions to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 2005 Zayed International Prize for the Environment, and the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Please welcome Dr. Ojima.
I want to thank Beth Conover, the organizing committee, and the Salazar Center for inviting me to share perspectives on the needs to engage partnerships to meet the needs of conservations today. Before I do that, though, I'd like to acknowledge events that took place at the United Nations General Assembly, where they called for urgent action to respond to climate change and reduce our emissions affecting climate change, and also to take action to reduce the rates of biodiversity loss and to meet our goals for sustainable development goals that they set forth for us several years ago. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge also that we're coming to the 50th anniversary of the United Nations first conference on the human environment, where at this conference, the United Nations recognized the human-induced harm it was taking on the environment and how collective action was needed to really address these emerging environmental issues that were undermining social well-being across the planet. They stated in their summary report, to defend and improve the human environment for present and future generations has become an imperative goal for humankind, a goal to be pursued together with and in harmony with the established and fundamental goals of peace and worldwide economic development. So these are sort of principles that guide us as we move toward looking at conservation efforts, especially in looking at our new initiatives related to 30 by 30. And from an ecosystem perspective and as a research scientist who spent the last 20 years trying to coordinate efforts to manage our environment around the globe, I'll provide these perspectives of how we look at 30 by 30 and other conservation efforts. I first see that the setting aside 30% of our lands in protected areas in our water systems is only a starting point, in that as we look at the impacts of climate change, fragmentation of our land systems, our management and diversions of our water systems, that we really need to think about this as a starting point and actually look at the other dynamics taking place in our protected areas and view these in both the dynamic in time and space. In time, we really need to start thinking about how the impacts of these disturbances that we're seeing due to climate change, the fires, the extreme storms, the droughts, are affecting our landscapes. And as we view these protected areas, these are dynamic areas, and that it will take decades and centuries for really the ecological and biological fabric that have been damaged and impacted by fires and droughts and these extreme storms to recover. And the biological assemblages may not be the same as we had in the past decade. So the recovery phase and the way that we view the transformation of these ecological systems is really a new area of research and interactions with managers to deal with these concerns. In a spatial context, we also need to think of these as not simple places of static nature, but that because of the dynamic nature of our biota, that and the migratory nature of our species, that it's important to look at the connectivity of these protected areas. We heard comments about the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative and the success it's had and the challenges of developing these partnerships to create this corridor going from the south to the north. But in addition, there are these elevational corridors that we need to address. And you heard about issues of mountain to prairies or peaks to plains. And so these initiatives in Colorado have been very important of providing these sort of altitudinal gradients, elevational gradients, to allow our species to migrate and to accommodate the type of impacts they're facing under climate change, and sort of opening up these ecosystems for them to migrate in response to climate change. As we look at developing these partnerships in looking at protected areas, we need to think about the people as well that utilize these systems. The incorporating indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and sort of people livelihoods in these areas that we're trying to create these protected areas and change their value or incorporate their values and how we change the way that we manage these systems. In these private-public partnerships, working with NGOs, working with research communities and technology providers are important, having everyone at the table. And developing these cooperative activities to manage our protected areas are going to be important. Along that line, in addition to what people are discussing in way of 30 by 30, the current administration also is proposing efforts to build a conservation workforce. The Civilian Climate Corps is going to be incredibly important to how we implement and manage and develop these protected areas for not only now, but for future generations. It's really an opportunity to generate a whole new cohort, a whole new generation of conservation-minded workforce that will help protect and restore our protected areas for coming generations. Again, a partnership is needed between the academic institutions, from science societies, and with early career professionals to get them engaged and trained to deal with the new management areas to implement the 30 by 30 conservation issues, and as well as to develop a new knowledge set to be more involved with the green infrastructure needed to protect these areas. Lastly, I want to comment on a recent report by the United Nations Environmental Program. It's titled Making Peace with Nature, with lead authors Ivar Basted and Bob Watson. In the report, they say everyone has a role to play in ensuring that human knowledge, ingenuity, technology, cooperation are redeployed for transforming nature to transforming humankind's relationship with nature. So it's really moving from being a consumptive actor in its relationship with nature to one where we are in a better partnership and a more respectful partnership with nature for us to succeed in our endeavors to develop. They also go on to say that all actors have individual, complementary, and nested roles in bringing about cross-sectoral and economy-wide transformative change with immediate and long-term impacts. And again, they're calling for a reassessment of our value of nature and our role in working with nature rather than being a consumptive agent of nature itself. And again, I call for building cooperative teams with indigenous and local knowledge, with other actors and practitioners, along with decision makers and scientists and technologists to come up with the appropriate solutions to protect our nature and our biodiversity. Thank you for your attention.
One back.
Sorry about that. Welcome back. Thanks for those insights, Dr. Ojima. Our next speaker is running a little late. I'm hoping we can go to a quick review of some of the artwork that our graphic recorder has been working on while we're waiting for him to come, and then we'll follow up with question and answer after Wade Crowfoot's presentation. Is there any way we can zoom in on different parts of that so folks can see it? That's great. Carrie, do you want to say anything about what you were recording here?
Sure, Beth. So, oh my goodness, what an incredible morning and into the afternoon we've had. There have been so many common themes and a lot of connections to yesterday's topics as well. And I'll really just let the graphics speak for themselves. Lots and lots of talk about equity and environmental justice and incorporation of Indigenous thoughts and flowing through really everything, which has been awesome to hear and record. And
Well, that's beautiful.
yeah, I'll let the work speak for itself. Thank you, Beth.
Great. Just as a reminder, everyone, that's Carrie Van Horn with Heartwood Visuals, who's been doing graphic recording of our meetings. She's going to do that for all 3 days of the symposium. And we will share those out with everyone who registered for the symposium after the fact. Thanks. I think we seem to be having a delay with Secretary Crowfoot joining us. So maybe in the meantime, we'll go to audience Q&A for Dr. Ojima. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, Beth. It's been a great session, both today and yesterday.
I'm curious, while I'm waiting for the feed on some of the questions that have come in, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or reflections on what you've seen so far at the symposium.
I think, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is the connection with community, especially the Indigenous communities and their long-term stewardship of the land that they live on. And I reflect on the UN report that I mentioned, making peace with nature, and really thinking about how we as a society, a Western society, really refocuses our values about how we view nature to our well-being. And I think lessons learned from the Indigenous communities I've worked with around the world, as well as the Native Americans here, are really critical to that. It's also important to also work with our local experts, our people who have been working on the land and really being stewards there as well. And I remarked, from Sally Jewell, who said, without working with some of the ranchers she wasn't able to get the bison transferred. Thinking of other questions or comments related to working with local communities in changing and having a common vision of what their values are, I think are really important.
That's great. I understand that Secretary Crowfoot is here. Let's go over to him and then we'll come back to question and answer after that. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dennis. Now we'll hear from Wade Crowfoot before going to audience question and answer. Wade was appointed California's Natural Resources Secretary by Governor Gavin Newsom in January of 2019. In this role, Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of 21,000 employees who protect and manage California's natural resources, including the state's forests and natural lands, rivers and waterways, coast and ocean, fish and wildlife, and energy development. I was lucky to work with Wade in an earlier role when he was at the Water Foundation, and we're thrilled to have him with us today. Thank you for joining us, Secretary Crowfoot.
Beth, thanks so much for having me. And Dennis, great to join you here in the discussion. Let me first say I'm honored to participate. The Salazar Center put together a remarkable set of panels that is driving forward on this issue. And while I haven't had a chance to actually attend the entire time, I wish I could. And I'm going to spend some time actually watching the recordings because the leaders that you've had in this panel, I think this collection is almost unprecedented. So today I want to provide a perspective of a subnational government, which is a fancy way to say, of course, our American states and provinces throughout the world. Clearly, national leadership is required in elevating nature-based solutions and working to expand environmental conservation to tackle climate change and the issues of the day. But I'll make the point that while national leadership and international collaboration is essential, so is state leadership and actually local leadership at the county and city level. Much of our land management, our governance in our country on land management, land ownership, land use is at the state and the local level. So from my perspective, it's remarkable that the Biden-Harris administration has set this 30 by 30 target and initiated America the Beautiful. And it's critical that actually states step up with a shared vision to actually achieve those environmental conservation goals. So I'm really excited on behalf of Governor Newsom in California to talk about all that we're doing with our own 30 by 30 effort, as well as complementary initiatives. I speak a lot about the role of nature in the crises of our time and what we're doing on environmental conservation. So let me share with you how I frame it with others. I start by invoking that immortal Charles Dickens lines from Great Expectations. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Certainly on sort of the worst of times ledger, we face unprecedented challenges in our world. Climate change is accelerating beyond what scientists thought even a decade ago, and that's accelerating impacts that are threatening our communities and our nature across the world. California, as you know, has a Mediterranean climate, much like Australia or South Africa. And so we call ourselves sort of at the tip of the spear in terms of climate impacts, or we're on the front lines of climate change. I'm 20 floors up at our building in Sacramento, and for most of the summer, I couldn't see more than half a mile in any direction because of the thick, noxious smoke from our wildfires. We face catastrophic wildfire risk across the American West that we've never known before. That's obviously fueled by climate change, increased winter temperatures, summer temperatures that are drying soils, drying vegetation, causing this natural ecological wildfire cycle to go crazy, to result in catastrophic wildfires, in some cases over 1 million acres in our state. We know climate change obviously is one cause, as is a century of misinformed fire suppression, where we try to take wildfire off the landscape. So you look at climate change impacts, catastrophic wildfire, certainly drought, the entire American West gripped by historic drought. Only a couple years after in California, our worst drought in modern history, we're staring down the barrel of a third straight dry year. and likely some unprecedented actions we'll need to take if we don't get heavy rain and snow this winter. At the same time this summer, communities across our state experienced the highest temperatures on record. We had our hottest June on record, followed by our hottest July on record, followed by our hottest August on record. And this is a threat to public health across the state, where temperatures are soaring over 110, 120 degrees in some places. And never far from our mind in California are these catastrophic flooding risks as our winter storms worsen and get more intense in these atmospheric rivers. And then, of course, sea level rise and all that brings to coastal states. So the climate crisis is here and more intense than ever, as is another planetary crisis, which is the crisis of mass extinction. We know that across our planet, the incredible variety of life is at risk. Some estimates suggest almost 40% of plant and animal species at some risk of extinction in coming decades. We in California are lucky to call ourselves a biodiversity hotspot in the world, that scientists identify 35 areas of the world that have remarkable variety of plants and animals and other life, but also under unique stressors, including climate change. So the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and then I'll call it the equity crisis. The last couple of years, we've been reckoning, this moment of reckoning across our country, across our state, recognizing that, first of all, not everybody enjoys access to the outdoors equally. And in fact, for many Californians, they had disconnected from the outdoors and lack access. We also know that we're tremendously disconnected from the tribal stewardship and leadership that actually cared for our natural environment since time immemorial. So those are the huge challenges we face. Now that's the worst of times, but then I'll say there is the best of, this is a sort of a moment of the best of times in some respects too, or a moment of tremendous opportunity for a few important reasons. One is the ascendance of nature in our discussions around what we need to do to combat climate change and species loss and equity. The recognition that we need to help nature help us, or position nature to help save us. So much of the discussion on climate action centers on technology, electrifying transportation, renewables across our landscapes and on our rooftops, energy efficient buildings and building decarbonization. And that's all really important, but missing from the conversation for so long was the role of nature, the role of our natural and working lands, as well as our oceans, to actually help stabilize our climate. And that's changed. Thanks to a lot of the leadership that's been represented in these panels today, nature and nature-based solutions now have a more central role in discussions on climate change. And that is really, really exciting. Why is nature being elevated? Because we have leaders across the world taking this on. This high ambition coalition of countries that have committed to 30 by 30. The Biden-Harris administration calling for this America the Beautiful initiative and 30 by 30. And then I would argue states like California, that a year ago in October 2020, our Governor Newsom set a 30 by 30 target for California. So that leadership is now being combined with major resource investments. Our governor announced last week that we are dedicating $15 billion of our state's budget surplus this year to fighting climate change. Some of that is so-called climate mitigation, how we reduce carbon pollution while continuing to grow our economy. And much of that is climate resilience. How do we protect people and nature from the impacts of climate change? And I'm really, really gratified to share that within that climate resilience agenda, nature and environmental conservation is at the top as it relates to the priority for that climate resilience. 30 by 30 in California is our North Star for the next 10 years, focused on how do we bring nature into the fight against climate change? How do we elevate these nature-based solutions to tackle climate change, biodiversity, and equity? We've taken this on in some, we think, pretty exciting ways. For the first time, we brought on in our agency a deputy secretary specifically focused on biodiversity and habitat. And that's a woman named Dr. Jennifer Norris, who is joining today. She has spearheaded a year of work across the state in regional symposia, in topical workshops, really understanding what are the challenges that nature faces in California, and then what are the key solutions, and where can we actually restore the environment, protect the environment, acquire or provide easements to improve environmental conservation. And that's all culminating in what we're calling a Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy that will be completed in February, in a few short months, where we're identifying the roadmap to conserve about 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030. Now, sneak peek on that, we identify that probably about 23% of our lands in California and a little less than that of our coastal waters are protected or conserved under our definition of conservation. And so we have significant work to do over the next 8 years to identify improved conservation and protection on about 7 to 8 million acres of land, given that California is a little over 100 million acres. Our strategies are probably not surprising for this group. It is enhancing conservation practices on public lands. Over half of California, about 53%, is owned and managed by the federal government. So enhancing conservation designations on federal lands is going to be really critical. I'm really excited that bipartisan legislation is moving its way through the US Congress to improve conservation designations on about 1 million acres of federal lands in California. We're going to also utilize some of that $15 billion budget to acquire lands in California for conservation purposes and improve incentives for conservation easements across private lands as well. These are only a couple of the many strategies that we're going to be identifying and linking to specific actions we're going to take in California as part of the national effort to achieve 30 by 30. I'm also really excited to share that we've partnered with Esri, which of course is one of the preeminent geospatial data companies in the world, to develop what we're calling CA Nature. And this is a geospatial system platform on which the public can actually understand land use designations across our state and the value that our lands and waters have with very high resolution for climate sequestration, biodiversity value, equitable access. And so really this is a decision support system that's going to identify where we're going to actually improve conservation on those upwards of 8 million acres plus to achieve 30 by 30. From our perspective, 30 by 30, whether you're in France or Costa Rica or the United States or California, cannot be a top-down exercise. We are not going to do that through some one-size-fits-all centrally planned initiative. We have to build partnerships with local governments, tribal governments, state, federal partnerships, and then with stakeholders from environmental conservation groups to in our state resource conservation districts, really identify where we're going to improve environmental conservation across our lands. Finally, we understand that this work has to happen more quickly than it's happened before, and we call this cutting the green tape. Simply put, we need to restore environmental habitat, do more to conserve our landscapes at larger scale more quickly. In California, believe it or not, historically, upwards of 1/3 of an environmental restoration project has the cost of about 1/3 of that project has been for planning and permitting. And a straightforward environmental restoration project can take years to actually make it through the permitting process. That can't happen. I talk about winning slowly is actually losing in the race to save nature. And so through this Cutting the Green Tape initiative, we're working to deploy those resources with the clear leadership more quickly so we can achieve 30 by 30 and the environmental restoration we need to achieve. Our state efforts, we intend to nest in this broader international effort, the 30 by 30 movement internationally, and the Conference of Parties that is taking place through United Nations convening on the Convention on Biodiversity, which, as many of you know, actually has its phase 1 of its meeting virtually in just a couple of weeks. California achieved official observer status as a subnational, and we're figuring in to provide input on draft 1 of that updated Convention on Biological Diversity at the international level. So California is working to do our part. We're learning from our tribal governments and communities. We're learning from other states that are doing innovative work. And of course, we're learning from all manner of external partners, including think tanks and groups like the Salazar Center that bring us all together. So Beth, this gives you a glimpse of what we're doing, and I'd be glad to share more thoughts or answer questions if participants have them here. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Beth.
Story of my life today. Thank you. We have a number of questions from the audience that I'd love to share with you all. And once again, it's fascinating to hear about California, which is really in front of the rest of the nation in many ways in trying out policies and programs that may be instructive for how folks move forward with these ideas into the future. So really interested in that. And along those lines, wondering, have you found a way, and this is primarily for Wade, have you found a way to gauge success with such a moving target? How will you know if you're succeeding?
It's a great question. And I think that's, for us in California, that's part of the power of the 30 by 30, a numeric target linked to environmental conservation. We've achieved real success or progress with these targets in the areas of, for example, renewable energy or energy efficiency, where we basically set a target over a long period of time and then shape state policy and state investments to reach that target. So in California, we think it works well to identify this 30% of our land base and our coastal waters. And then, Beth, we'll be measuring over time our progress towards 30%. Of course, part of the question is how we define conservation, and it is can be a controversial question. We talk about conservation a little differently than we talk about protection, because we want to improve conservation on working lands. So, for example, cattle ranches that are under specific environmental easement to rebuild soils and care for watersheds. So, I think there's a lot of interest in 30 by 30 around how countries or states like ours are defining conservation. But part of this pathways are setting ourselves on some clearly measurable actions where we can assess our progress over time.
Great, thank you. Maybe related to that, what do you think has been learned in California's work on climate and biodiversity that might be applied nationally or even internationally?
It's a really good question. I mean, I would say, well, one is just the partnership of the state and the federal agencies is essential. All of our states have regulatory agencies that protect the environment along with these federal agencies. We have land management agencies, whether it's our state parks or our Department of Fish and Wildlife that manages over 1 million acres of ecological preserves. And historically, there's been too much siloization between our federal land management agencies and our state land management agencies, our federal regulators and our state regulators. And remarkably, we have an opportune moment in California because the president and the governor have set the same goal. So we have a body in California that I think can serve as a model to other state federal partnerships, and we call it the Biodiversity Council. And it's all of our federal agencies and our state agencies together, actually, in a sort of a shared collaboration, organized collaboration. And so right now, we are identifying 3 to 5 specific priority areas that we want to work together through that council on, state, federal, to achieve our 30 by 30. So for example, it could be specifically enhancing conservation designations, or it could be improving specific conservation practices. So that's, I think, one thing that we've learned is just the importance of the intergovernmental partnerships.
That makes sense. Great, thank you. Quick question primarily for Dennis. Does the Endangered Species Act have ambitious policies to address biodiversity loss and impacts of climate change?
Certainly, I think in the way that we look at the ecological windows around these are endangered species, and noting actually today where 23 species were listed. I think Deb Holland, Secretary Holland, mentioned that today, that it was an unfortunate news note that these 23 species were marked as extinct from our federal lands, from our nation and from the world. And so as we look at how we view our conservation efforts within the Endangered Species Act, that we could see sort of the climate influence on their habitat. And especially as we look at 3030, and as we think about that number of 30%, it does kind of hide the fact that there are critical zones within those 30% that need to be protected. There's wetlands, riparian areas that are very special, that are being impacted by climate change and other land uses and pollution, that because of the Endangered Species Act, and actually the National Parks Act as well, and conserving these lands as priority 1 areas, those two acts have a lot of power to combat climate change and to incorporate climate change remediation within their policy instruments.
Great.
Great. Beth, something that Dennis said just made me remember an important point to make, which is from our perspective, 30 by 30 cannot be the end. In other words, it needs to be a means to improved environmental conservation. And so it's a metric, much like our renewable portfolio standards around the country are stimulating more renewable energy, but it's not the end all be all for transforming our energy systems. I'd say number one. Number two, clearly the Federal Endangered Species Act, and we have a state version, have been critical to saving a lot of species from extinction. But I compare that to sort of emergency room medicine. If all we're doing on someone's health is treating them when they make it into the emergency room, we are not, that's not a positive future. So I think the ESA needs to continue to be that backstop, but it's a single species focus. And we need to step up, upstream from that. And how are we actually protecting and restoring ecosystems and their related habitat so that we prevent species from actually getting to the brink?
Great, that makes sense. Thank you, Wade. Let's see, next question. One came from the audience for you, Wade. If the national target is 30 by 30, did California consider setting a higher land protection target given the amount of rare natural beauty in the state?
Well, right now we're set on 30 by 30, and I have to say it's a daunting and ambitious goal in its own right. Again, if we use the kind of protected status database from the U.S. Geological Service, we're talking about needing to improve conservation on 8 million acres over the next 8 years. And so we're focused on 30 by 30, but I will observe that, something that's happened with climate targets is sort of a race to the top in terms of improving and increasing ambition. So that may happen over time.
Gotcha. Good. For Dennis and Wade, if you want to weigh in as well, what can the research community bring to this evolving set of issues and challenges, and how, and maybe with examples, is the research community working together with those responsible for realizing these goals?
There's a strong role for ecological research in this area, especially as we look at these landscape connectivities. I mentioned the elevation gradients that we're pulling together in Colorado, and these have been sort of encouraged and looked at through research activities, looking at the migratory patterns of our plants and wildlife, and bringing that information together. As we look at some of the drought and fire exposures that we're seeing now, there's new technologies, new instrumentation that we have to really observe preconditions that set up wildfires And, the West has been being impacted by these, what we're calling flash droughts. And so there's new technologies that we're able to see the evaporative nature of the atmosphere and predict or project a little bit more quickly when these flash droughts occur. As we move in these uncertain times to look at the landscape changes that we're being influenced and experiencing with these wildfires, we're going to see decades and centuries of recovery of these ecosystem structures that we're not quite sure about. So adaptive management and research that incorporates adaptive management in their work with managers will really be important about how we be agile and flexible to accommodate these ecosystem changes that are transforming our landscapes due to these extreme events of fires, floods, and droughts.
Great.
I couldn't agree more. And I would just add, part of what we need to do across the research community with government is to really organize ourselves to identify what are sort of the key questions we need to answer, to Dennis's point on the impacts of climate change, for example. We think a lot about climate refugia on species and what are the habitat corridors that are needed. And, we have remarkable resources across the country and in the state of California. And at worst, it's like, the very smart people are doing work in silos and we're not connecting. So in California, several leaders, including the University of California system and the California state system and our California Academy of Sciences, have put themselves together in what's called a biodiversity network. And part of what we're doing in this pathways strategy is asking them, what are the key research needs that we all collectively need to address on 30 by 30, but biodiversity more broadly. And I think that holds a lot of potential. I would also say for researchers, help us, to Dennis's point, adaptive and forward-looking. For example, in California, we've had this absolute collapse of our kelp forest off the coast in Northern California. That's essentially like the redwoods of our underwater ecosystems. And we don't, fully know why that is. And so we're working to actually with researchers to help us figure that out and start to adaptively experiment around how to bring them back. But more forward-looking, practically applied research could be really helpful to these challenges we're now facing in real time.
And if I might just add that in addition to just the research side of things, the training side is really important as well. And as we envision the Civilian and Climate Corps, the merger between what we're doing in research to how management will be conducted in the future and how we actually restore landscapes in coastal areas and other fragile areas under these climate change threats, it's really important to sort of thinking about how we actually develop this new generation of conservation-oriented, conservation thinking workforce that includes sort of incorporation of current or emerging research activities, as well as the training needed to understand how to use that information.
And let me just leapfrog and say that community-driven science, which we used to call citizen science, is really helpful. We now have, remarkable power on our iPhones to actually play our own role in providing the census of biodiversity through apps like iNaturalist and others. And when we do that, not only do we add to that biodiversity database, but we engage regular people in actually protecting and restoring nature. So while we have really smart researchers across the country, if we can complement that with that community-driven science, it'll help our scientific effort, but also our movement building.
That's great. I know that app and its companion Seek have become favorite companions for my family when we're out and about the woods. Very helpful. Good. Wade, how do you see the ground up leadership unfolding? How will communities be engaged in and centered in the leadership for the work that California is doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we're challenged with this across climate resilience, because I think that the sort of normal governmental approach would be, top-down planning, top-down policy making, and, funding programs. And what we realize in California, but I think you could extrapolate this across America, is places experience climate disruption so differently, right? Urban Los Angeles compared to that, forested north coast of California, our Sierra Nevadas compared to the Bay Area. And so we need to empower local collaboration to really prioritize what are the most important investments. So for 30 by 30, our first outreach was actually regionally based. And we would have done it in person had it not been for COVID, but we had, I believe, 9 convenings across the state virtually. And remarkably, we had between 300 and 600 people in each of those convenings. And so our pathways document is going to have a special focus on regional challenges and opportunities. And then part of our strategy moving forward is to empower those regions, their leaders, their communities, local government, tribal governments to come together around key priorities. And then it's the state and federal government through the Land and Water Conservation Fund at the federal level or our funding at the state level that are pushing funding into the regions for their own priorities. So that's kind of the loose governance vision that we have. And it's gonna really rely on regional leadership, but some interesting partnerships, including with philanthropy, to build capacity in those regions to prioritize what needs to take place.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Dennis, another question for you. Does the Ecological Society of America, the other ESA, have some ambitious policies to address biodiversity loss and the impacts of climate change?
Our membership community is involved in these conservation efforts at large, and we're also working closely with the
Did we lose Dennis? Is he frozen for you, Wade?
Yeah, he looks like he froze up.
Okay. Maybe I'll ask you a quick question while we're waiting to get him back. And I think we'll wrap this up soon. What would you say have been the biggest challenges in California to addressing climate and biodiversity simultaneously?
Well, I would say that climate change, broadly conceived, hasn't integrated nature and biodiversity. So again, 20 years of climate leadership, internationally, nationally, and even in our state, has focused on how do we reduce carbon pollution? How do we move beyond fossil fuels? How do we, again, decarbonize buildings, renewable energy? All that's good, but nature-based solutions, biodiversity, we're not even in the climate discussion until the last couple of years. They were in a very different silo. And the biodiversity conversation was limited to how do we protect or prevent species from becoming extinct. So we're involved in a broad paradigm shift where we're working to center nature in our climate agenda and to really explain nature is not a nice to have. If we're going to actually stabilize the planet, it's a have to have. And so I would say the biggest challenge is just that paradigm shift in bringing nature and nature-based solutions into the discussion on climate change and connecting the dots between the need to preserve biodiversity and the need to stabilize our climate. Again, at worst, they're seen as separate, disconnected goals. But when you actually look at all of the science and all of the recommendations from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, they say we need nature. We need better land and water management to actually achieve our carbon goals, our climate goals. So that's really been the biggest challenge, is just truly shifting the paradigm to bring them into the same conversation.
Right, great. Thank you both so much for your insights today. We so appreciate your help and presentations and just being part of our symposium. This question about how to continue to move forward thinking and talking about climate and biodiversity goals simultaneously seems so important. And I think the work both of you are doing is very central to that. So thanks so much for the conversation. We're going to, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I just want to add a compliment to Wade. He received a recognition this year at the Ecological Society's annual meeting for the civil service that he's been serving in California for ecological systems. And it's really an honor to be on a panel with him at this time. And
Well,
he's keeping up the good work, the great work. There it
Dennis,
is.
I have to say that was one of my proudest moments in the first 3 years, and you could see the award that you generously gave me right on my desk. So I'm proud to do the work and continue the partnership.
That's awesome. I'm glad you got that in there. That's a fitting end. Okay, good. We're going to go into a break for the next 10 minutes. We'll be back around 1:25. Thanks so much.
Right.